Hey guys, Mogami K here. Welcome to the first episode of Mogami K's Pizza Chime Theatre. Steam locomotives can be found across the United States today. Unfortunately, not everyone could have made it. Grab a bucket of popcorn, sit down, and relax, as today I'll list 10 steam locomotives that went the way of the dodo. Before I start, I didn't steal this idea, as other railfan YouTubers have done this before. I'm just putting a spin on it my way. Alright, let's go.
10.
The Maine Central S-Class. The Maine Central S-Class are 282 or Mikado type steam locomotives built by the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO for short, between 1914 and 1918. They were numbered 601 to 620. In 1919, the United States Railroad Administration, the USRA, gave 6 of their light Mikados to the Maine Central, and the Maine Central numbered them 621 to 626. They were designated the S1 subclass. In 1924, the Maine Central bought 6 more Mikes, numbering them from 627 to 632, giving the Maine Central a total of 32 Mikados. Ironically, my favorite number. The S-Class Mikes were best remembered for their service on the Mountain Division from 1929 onwards after the X-Class mallets were scrapped. Mikes that were known for working near St. Johnsbury, Vermont were nicknamed Big Mickeys. Retirement of the Mikes started early as 1936, but by the early 1950s, diesel locomotives started entering the Maine Central scene. The last 2 Mikados, numbers 623 and 625, were scrapped in January 1956. Seeing as Mikados are very common steam locomotives today, it's a shame that the Maine Central ones didn't escape the scrapper's torch. Oh well.
9.
The Baltimore and Ohio Big Sixes. The 210-2, nicknamed the Santa Fe type, first appeared on the Baltimore and Ohio in 1914, when it ordered 31 from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. They were numbered 6000 to 6030. The S1s, which were built between 1923 and 1924, comprised of 50 locomotives from Baldwin, numbers 6100 to 6149, and 25 from the Lima Locomotive Works, numbers 6150 to 6174. And get this, the S1As, built in 1926, consisted of 25 more locomotives from Lima, numbers 6175 through 6199, and then they returned to Baldwin for 25 more, numbers 6200 to 6224. Yeah, it's kind of a big mess. The S1s and the S1As corrected some issues over the earlier Class S's. The engines were considered the best Santa Fe's ever built, being fast, powerful, and reliable, being well loved by the B&O. 3 210-2s were later rebuilt or modified by the B&O, making the S1B. And then numbers 6105 and 6168 had similar changes to 6222, creating the S1C. In the 1950s, the Big Sixes started being retired and scrapped. In 1956, the remaining Big Sixes were renumbered 500 to 538. The last Big Six was gone by 1959. I'll give credit. The B&O did a great job of keeping its history alive, but it was also facing some big money problems at the time. That's probably why none of the Big Sixes were kept around for preservation. The Atlantic Coastline R1s. During the mid-1930s, the Atlantic Coastline's P5A Class 462 Pacifics couldn't handle more than 12 passenger cars and would require double heading due to an increase in passenger business. The R1s, a class of 12 484 Northerns, were built by Baldwin between March and May 1938. Although they proved their worth, the R1s had poor counterbalancing and were returned to Baldwin to solve the problem. They had bad dynamic augment. Even after new disc driving wheels, they still had unacceptable amounts of dynamic augment at high speeds due to their counterbalancing weights being too high. Despite their flaws, they were capable pullers. Number 1800 accelerated a 20-car passenger train up to 70 miles per hour during a test run. With dieselization taking effect, the locomotives were put in the freight service. When it comes to scrap dates, we actually have the days in which this progress occurred. 8 were scrapped on December 20th, 1951, and 4 on June 20th, 1952. Only the engines themselves were scrapped. 10 tenders were sold to the Norfolk and Western to be used on their Y4 class, until the Y4s were scrapped in 1958, leaving the R1 to vanish out of memory.
7.
The Milwaukee Road
F6 class. The F6 and F6A classes consisted of 22 464 Hudsons, or what the railroad called Baltics. The F6s were built by Baldwin between January and March 1930, while the F6As were built between October and November 1931. On July 20th, 1934, 6402 participated in a test run to prove the feasibility of a high-speed service, which was launched as the famed Hiawatha service in 1935. In 1936, as an experiment, 6401 received elephant ear smoke deflectors. In 1938, the F6s were renumbered from 125 to 138, and the F6As from 139 to 146. Sometime during the 30s or 40s, the F6s had air horns put on top of their boilers and behind their smokestacks, like their more famous brothers, the F7s. In 1952, the locomotives were modernized, and starting in August, started to retire. They were all cut up for scrap by December 1954. At least the memory of the Baltics are still in the history books.
6.
The Erie Road S3 Berkshires. Before we talk about the Erie S3, we have to mention the Van Swearingen brothers. At their zenith in 1928, the Van Swearingen brothers controlled the Erie, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Pere Marquette, and the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, more generally known as the Nickel Plate Road. The S3s were built between July and October 1928 by Baldwin and consisted of 35 locomotives, numbers 3350 to 3384. The S3s were designed to carry freight as well as passenger trains. Among the most well-known and liked classes of any Erie steam locomotive, the S3s were seen sometimes also as helpers during the 1940s and 50s. They were all retired after World War II, starting with engines 3361 and 3373 in April 1950. In 1951, as part of the Erie Road's 100th anniversary, number 3369 was used for a public show pushing a caboose. Engines 3360 and 3378 were the last two S3s withdrawn in October 1952. All of them were scrapped. We have Nickel Plate Road, Pere Marquette, and C&O Berkshire surviving. Only if we had an Erie Berk to complete the Advisory Mechanical Committee's Big Four. The Northern Pacific A-Class. Another Northern on the list? But these are pretty special. At the time, the Northern Pacific needed a new steam locomotive for their usage on their system. Built by Alco in 1926, the 12 members of the A-Class are the very first of what are known as the 484 wheel arrangement. During its lifetime, the A-Class hauled the railroad's North Coast Limited passenger train from St. Paul, Minnesota to Livingston, Montana. Withdrawal of the A-Class started in 1949, and the last example was out of service by 1959, and all 12 examples were cut up for scrap, thus rendering them extinct. If it wasn't for Northern Pacific's 2600 through 2611, we wouldn't have locomotives like Southern Pacific's GS4s or Norfolk and Western's J-Class today.
4.
The Virginian Railway MB class Mikados. In 1909, the recently built Virginian Railroad needed a new kind of freight locomotive. Enter the MB class, a fleet of 42 Mikados built between May 1909 and September 1910 by Baldwin, and were numbered 420 to 461. The MBs were described as multi-purpose. They were good for switching, hauling heavy coal drags, fast freights, and even passenger trains, as well as serving as pusher locomotives on steep grades. According to the Virginian Railway book by H. Reed, the MBs were described as the Virginian's greatest locomotive, and if the MB was to occupy the hero's role, it had to be a talented actor. In May 1937, 4 MBs were sold to the Montour Railroad, while 2 were sold to the Algoma Central and Hudson Bay Railroad. In 1938, the Virginian Railway began to retire the MBs in favor of more modern equipment. By 1956, number 432, the last member of the class in service, became the last steam locomotive to operate on the railroad's Roanoke theater of operations. In February 1959, the last 2 engines, numbers 432 and 459, which were placed in storage after retirement, were cut up for scrap. This is pretty tragic, as this class of locomotive was considered a celebrity on the railroad it ran on. Who knew even steam locomotives have a big fall from grace? The Union Pacific's Light Challengers. Now onto common territory when it comes to extinct locomotive lists. Not to be confused with the Heavy Challengers, these brutes were the results of one man, Arthur H. Fetter. In the 1930s, the Union Pacific Railroad needed a new class of locomotives to tackle the mountain passes of Sherman Hill and the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. The 9000 class were tried out but couldn't handle the tight curves of the route due to their exceptionally long, rigid frames. Fetter went to the drawing board to create a new steam locomotive by splitting the 12 driving wheel frame in half and having it joined by a huge pin in the middle so the engine could bend around tight curves. Alco built 40 of these 4664 locomotives between 1936 and 1937. They were classified as CSA-1 and CSA-2. In 1949, a few Challengers were renumbered because of a coal strike. Sadly, all 40 Fetter Challengers were retired from active service when the Union Pacific began to dieselize their lines. All of them were scrapped between 1957 and 1958. Although we don't have a Light Challenger in preservation, their younger and bigger brothers, the Big Boys and Heavy Challengers, are still around today to please rail fans. The Santa Fe 1337 class. The 1337 class consisted of 52 Pacifics built by Baldwin between 1912 and 1913 and were numbered 1337 to 1388. In 1929, 1373 appeared in 2 Hal Roach shows, Laurel and Hardy, and the most infamous, Our Gang, which is known as the Little Rascals. In 1939, locomotives 1369 and 1376 were semi-streamlined and pulled the newly introduced Valley Flyer. The Valley Flyer was operated to handle the increased travel to the Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco's Treasure Island. The semi-streamlining was gone 3 years after. The 1337s began to retire in 1938, and all were gone by 1954. I decided to put these on a very high spot due to no one ever talking about them, and their forgotten stardom gives them interesting histories. Welcome to the Honorable Mention section. Here are the steam locomotives that did not make the list, but I would like to mention anyway. And now, my number 1 extinct steam locomotive is the Southern Pacific's MT Mountains. I'm including all 5 class of MTs on this spot as one. The first batch, the MT1s, were built by Alco between 1923 and 1924 and were numbered 4300 to 4327. The 1924 built MT2s were numbers 4385 to 4390? Very strange. The MT2s were the result of the Southern Pacific's purchase of the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad. The MT3s, MT4s, and MT5s were built by the Southern Pacific Sacramento shops between 1925 and 1930. The MT3s were numbered 4328 to 4345. The MT4s, which have been mentioned in these videos before, were numbered 4346 to 4366, and the MT5s were numbered 4367 to 4376. The MT2s looked different from the others due to them being acquisitions instead of new build, with the MT1s eventually receiving the MT2's multiple bearing crossheads. From late 1929 to early 1930, MT1 number 4326 used the tender from 412-2 number 5000. The MT2s have generally been regarded as Rio Grande Division engines until they were transferred to California in the late 1940s. Although, in the 1930s and early 1940s, some of the engines occasionally got to Los Angeles, and even as far north as San Francisco's Mission Bay. Over the years, the MTs received skyline casing, giving them a streamlined look to them. 5 MT4s received daylight paint schemes in 1946 and 1947, those being 4350, 4352, 4353, 4361, and 4363, and were the first to be equipped with Leslie A200 air horns. And by 1949 and into the 1950s, other 482s with the skyline cases added received air horns, but perhaps not all of them. The MT2s never received the air horns. By the mid-1950s, the SP was starting its dieselization process, which meant the end of the MT's service. All of them were gone between 1953 and 1958 and sadly cut up for scrap. I really loved talking about the Southern Pacific MT mountains and how much we know a lot about them, and even what made some of them look unique from the others. I consider the Southern Pacific MT Mountains as the top dog of extinct steam locomotives. Well, that was a mouthful. Thanks for watching Mogami K's Pizza Chime Theatre's first episode. I hope you guys like the format. And should I start making more train videos in the future? I have nothing else to say. Thanks for watching, and see you later.